A court in Prague releases a former PYD leader sought by Turkey. Ankara warns of a day of reckoning for the Czech Republic. I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Salih Muslum. Salih Muslum has a $1 million bounty on his head, a reward that Turkey hopes will lead to the capture of the man it says is behind a series of deadly attacks. So when the Czechs arrested Muslum on an Interpol warrant, Ankara demanded his immediate extradition. But instead, the court released Muslum the following day. His lawyer praised the decision, saying his client is a peaceful man who will stay in the EU and cooperate with legal proceedings. Turkish officials weren't as optimistic. Turkey's deputy prime minister slammed the court's decision, calling it political and a clear support for terror groups. Here's Christine Provalakis.
Salih Muslum is one of Turkey's most wanted terrorists. The government had offered a $1 million bounty for his capture and had been tracking his movements as he traveled from one European country to another. Muslum was finally captured and arrested in Prague, but a Czech court released him. Turkey is continuing to push for his extradition.
The Czech court made a decision, but this decision doesn't mean that everything's over. We will not stop chasing this issue, even if Salih Muslum goes to another country.
Muslum is accused of being connected to a bombing in Ankara in February 2016 that killed 30 people. He denies any connection to the attack, which was claimed by a PKK splinter group called the TAK. Muslum is the co-founder of the Syrian group, the PYD. It controls swaths of territory in northern Syria after it expelled rival Kurdish groups from the area. It's also connected to the PKK terror group, whose decades-old campaign in Turkey has resulted in thousands of deaths. Turkey is now conducting a military offensive in northern Syria to push the YPG, the PYD's armed affiliate, back from its border. Although both Turkey and the European Union consider the PKK a terror organization, its supporters have been allowed to operate and demonstrate freely across the bloc. Turkey says Muslum is too dangerous to be set free. But a Czech court accepted his promise to remain within the EU and participate in all extradition proceedings requested by Turkey. If successful, it would be one of the most significant captures of a wanted Kurdish separatist since the PKK founder Abdullah Öcalan was detained in 1999. Turkey's efforts to extradite those on its most wanted list hasn't always gone according to plan. Since 2016, Turkey has demanded Washington extradite Turkish cleric Fethullah Gülen, who's been living in self-imposed exile in Pennsylvania since 1999. Turkey accuses Gülen of leading a cult. It says its followers have infiltrated every institution of the Turkish state and attempted to overthrow their government in a failed coup. But so far, the United States has refused to return Gülen. Germany has also been reluctant to send coup suspects back to Turkey, as has Greece. An Athens court has rejected Ankara's demands to hand over 8 Turkish military officers who are seeking asylum there. But Turkey hopes it will have more luck getting Salih Muslum back, as it did with the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. He was captured in Italy in 1998, only for Turkey to have his extradition request denied. At the time, Italy barred the extradition of prisoners to countries that had the death penalty. The Turkish intelligence service finally captured Öcalan in Kenya the following year. He was sentenced to life imprisonment after Turkey abolished the death penalty in hopes of joining the EU. Muslum now faces 30 life sentences if found guilty. But will Turkey be successful in bringing him to justice? Christine Provalakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Peter Galbraith, a former US diplomat and advisor to the Kurdish regional government of Iraq. In San Diego, we have Nick Vamos, the former head of extradition at the UK's Crown Prosecution Service. And with me here in studio, we have political analyst Onur Erim and Hakkı Öcal, the political editor for the pro-government Turkish newspaper Milliyet. Gentlemen, I thank you all for joining us. Onur Erim, let me begin with you. The fact that Salih Muslum was in the Czech Republic, detained, Turkey wanted him extradited, but the Czechs let him go. You can't be happy about that.
I don't think anybody in their right mind could be happy about this. The organization is a, it's a stamped organization for being a terrorist organization worldwide, including the U.S. Salih Muslum is known for a fact that he's the leader, and he's been captured after Turkey's request with Interpol, with the Red Bulletin. He's being captured, yet he's being let go. Who can be happy about this? In what way? I have no idea.
Peter Galbraith, were the Czechs right to let him go?
I wasn't in the courtroom, but I think what's clear is that the Czechs did not think there was sufficient evidence to justify his detention. And they also were prepared to accept his word that he would appear in court. Turkey's sort of conduct, particularly post-coup, raises a lot of questions about the quality of justice in the country. And I think that probably taints any effort to go after somebody whose arrest looks primarily to be political. While Turkey considers the PYD, the party that Salih Muslum founded and for a long time headed, to be a terrorist organization, or really to be the same as the PKK, the rest of the world does not. And in fact, the PYD really has been an ally of the United States in fighting the Islamic State terrorists in Turkey, in Syria.
Okay.
So I think for these reasons, the court just didn't find the case that Turkey had presented to be very persuasive.
Okay.
And if you look at things, I mean, with a novelist, for example, arrested for giving or sentenced to life in prison, and this is in the New York Times today, for giving subliminal signals about the coup the day before, it really does raise questions about the quality of justice in Turkey.
Okay, so 2 points made there. Hake Öcal, why don't you tackle them? Number one, the quality of justice in Turkey. And number two, that connection that Turkey makes between the PKK and the YPG. Peter Galbraith is saying not everybody makes that connection. So it's fine if you make the connection, but not necessarily for the Czechs or other European countries.
Everybody does. I mean, hey, look, only last week at the United States Congress, there was this document disclosed by the U.S. National Security Apparatus that PYD and YPG were directly related with PKK. U.S. recognized PKK as a terrorist organization. And Turkey didn't ask them to try him or anything, just to extradite. And they are part of the same agreement with Turkey. They have to respect Turkish request. Did it take only 10 minutes for Czech court to evaluate Turkish request? No, it is this blanket argument that the quality of justice in Turkey after the coup attempt is not good. It is self-infatuation. I mean, everybody, including Mr. Galbraith, are falling in love with this statement. It is not true. There is justice in Turkey, and its quality is as good as the United States justice. Where this idea came from, I don't understand. I mean, there was a coup, and there was...
Okay, he pointed to a novelist who's spending life in prison.
Novelist, he is not a novelist. He is novelist after the fact. Actually, he is a newspaper columnist. He is a newspaper general editor. He made general comments on television, implying that, showing that he knew that this coup was coming. He threatened the president and the whole elected government with certain terms. I mean, when you say this, he's a novelist or something, you throw him in because of his novels?
Okay, and I guess we could debate the merits, the pros and cons of that case another time.
Inshallah.
But I want to kind of move on to Nick Vamos here and talk about Salih Muslum again. So, Nick, there's an interesting thing here. On the one hand, we're looking at whether there was a threshold of evidence that might show that Salih Muslum was actually involved in terrorism against Turkey. On the other hand, if he is a member of a listed terror organization, do you actually need any evidence that he was involved in any any terror attacks on Turkey because the PKK is a listed terror organization. Which one sort of takes precedence when it comes to what Turkey is asking of the Czechs?
Well, if he is found to be a member of a designated terrorist organization that the Czech Republic recognizes, and they also have an offense of being a member of a recognized terrorist organization, then most of the evidence is going to be just proving those facts, and the underlying terrorist act that he's accused of will be less relevant. But can I just point out, as Peter Galbraith did, all the Czech court have done is granted him bail. And that's a judicial decision based on the facts that presented to them. It hasn't gone any further than that in the Czech Republic yet.
Right. Okay. So, Onur Erim, the fact that he's just been granted bail, what do you want to happen next?
Well, I mean, we can't. First of all, we can just let go this situation of him being just granted bail. He's possibly going to be free to move within the European Union.
We're hearing he might go to Finland.
And right. He's also a resident, from what we understand, of Finland. It is not an excuse for doing anything. Talking about, going back to the previous points, we have to realize, we have to understand that this organization is known, not just by this administration, but the administration before, the U.S. administration before, as a terrorist organization. That's number one. And for any country in the world, especially the U.S., to accuse Turkish justice system anything less than decent or good, they have to explain what they have done in Guantanamo Bay, to say the least. But let's get back to our point. We do not ask as Turks for anything besides justice. Now, we have an organization that's known, that's validated by most countries, including the U.S., as a terrorist organization. We have a guy who led this, co-chaired this terrorist organization. This guy has been captured. He has to be extradited to Turkey. Right. That's the way it should be. And I hope and I wish that the Czech Republic, as the rumors that are going around in the newspapers over there, are not looking to this as a trade-off with the two other Czech terrorists that are in prison in Turkey right now.
Okay, now we don't have any evidence of that. I mean, this is kind of noise at the moment.
Exactly.
Right? Peter Galbraith, let me ask you in the sort of cold, harsh light of day, in terms of the geopolitics, if the YPG was not involved in the fight against Daesh or ISIS, would you care about this guy's fate or anybody else connected to the group?
Well, I would care about somebody getting a fair trial, but I think that it's important to look at who Salih Muslum is. He was the founder of a Syrian party that certainly the only Turkey considers this Syrian party to be the PKK. I mean, however much your other guests wish to say it's the PKK, the fact is that there are 2,000 American special forces fighting alongside the troops of that that are related to that organization. It is the organization that has been the most effective in fighting terrorism.
No,
and Salih Muslum has been a political leader.
Galbraith, if you allow me to come in just for a second.
I might add that he lost his son to terrorists.
Certainly, and fair enough. He lost his son in the fight against ISIS. Let me just sort of jump in here for a second, and you can expand on it for a second. Isn't it a bit disingenuous to say it's only Turkey saying this when even the YPG themselves claimed somebody who was involved in an Ankara bombing on behalf of the PKK. So somebody blew up civilians in Ankara, a woman. She was a part of the urban wing of the PKK. The YPG on their website claimed her afterwards and said, she trained with us in Syria. So they themselves are saying, hey, there's a connection between us, right? So I can well understand that you're saying tactically on the battlefield in northern Syria right now, enemy of my enemy is my friend. But isn't it a bit of denialism to say that, oh, well, only Turkey is only saying there's a link between them and there's no other evidence that checks out?
Well, first, I don't know these things, points you're making about what was on the website. I think that the U.S. does believe, and obviously I don't speak for the U.S. government. I'm a private citizen now. But I think the U.S. government does believe that these are separate organizations, that they do not think that U.S. weapons are going to the PKK to be used against the fight in Turkey. And as I said, they see the organization that Salih Muslum has headed for many years as being an ally. And as I noted, he lost his own son in the fight against the Islamic State. And one could look at Turkey's record on some of the fight against terrorism. Many of the Islamic State fighters came through Turkey because the country, frankly, didn't have sufficient controls. And there have been cases of Turkish intelligence officers who have been arrested in Turkey for having engaged in terrorist acts, which they tried to blame on the PKK. I don't think that makes the Turkish intelligence services a terrorist organization at all. I mean, and so I don't think that if this woman had some connection to the YPG or the YPJ, I don't think that makes the whole PYD, YPG, YPJ into a terrorist organization.
Which one?
Obviously, the act that took place in Turkey was terrorism.
Okay. Onur Erim or Hakkı Öcal, which one of you wants to jump in here? Tell me.
It is, I mean, either, not us, but any high school kid in Turkey could respond to these allegations. I mean, YPG itself, PKK itself, claims that they are the same members of the same organization, which is called KCK. It is the umbrella organization, right. And you go to Afrin, for instance, right now, Turkish army is trying to clean the terrorists from. Every street corner has these Abdullah Öcalan posters displayed in town. Abdullah Öcalan is the founder of PKK, who is in jail right now. I mean, it is so obvious. You should be blind to claim what Mr. Galbraith does. Right
okay, can I take what you said there, now that you mentioned Öcalan, and I want to, whatever you wanted to say, Onur, can you add it to this question? How much of a big deal is Salih Muslum, really? I mean, he's the former sort of leader of this organization. Is he worth all the effort that Turkey is putting into it, trying to get him back here? And will it have any impact operationally, symbolically, or otherwise on Operation Olive Branch right now in Syria? Is he worth all the trouble?
If you've been following President Erdogan since the beginning on terrorism, he's got zero tolerance. So he may be the former co-chairman. He may not be very involved right now, but Tayyip Erdogan, when it comes to Turkey, when it comes to neighboring countries, when it comes to the world on terrorism, he's got zero tolerance. So yes, he is as important right now as the current, leaders of YPG or PKK, because he has zero tolerance. Tayyip Erdogan has been saying the same thing since day one. There is no good terrorist, there is no bad terrorist. Terrorism is a world crime. The gentlemen, I guess, are overlooking the fact that YPG is not considered only by Turkey as a terrorist organization. It's been said over and over by the U.S. officials at the toppest level that they are also. The fact that the U.S. has made one of the biggest mistakes of its history in the region, arming and cooperating with a terrorist organization like YPG, does not validate the organization as a non-terrorist organization. And the U.S. will suffer, not through us, but throughout the region, will suffer the consequences of this.
Peter Galbraith, you want to jump in?
Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to point out that Salih Muslum was invited to Turkey and visited Turkey and had meetings with Turkish intelligence officials and perhaps other Turks not very long ago.
No, totally.
So if Turkey if Tayyip Erdogan thought he was a terrorist, then why did Tayyip Erdogan?
They had a falling out, right? No, they had a falling out. There was a peace process,
just like US and Taliban.
No, but there was a peace process indeed, and that's being spoken about here as well. Nick Vamos, what are the chances of extradition? Turkey wants extradition. What are their chances legally, and are they dealing with the Czech courts, or are they dealing with the EU courts when it comes to this?
Well, they're dealing directly with the Czech courts, but the challenge for Turkey is to persuade the rest of the world that they are not making politically motivated extradition requests. And the problem is, if you issue political threats through your senior officials before somebody's arrested, at the point that they're arrested, and then criticize the court after all they've done is grant him bail, and these are political criticisms done by senior figures within the Turkish authorities, if you take all of those steps, then you are proving the rest of the world's point that this is a politically motivated process.
Okay.
This is meant to be a judicial decision
that's an interesting
based
point.
on facts and based on evidence. And all of these political interventions are undermining Turkey's efforts.
Okay, so let me take that point because we are running out of time. I want to take that point and pose it to Hakkı Öcal. So, Bekir Bozdağ, the government spokesperson, Turkish Deputy Prime Minister, saying that what the Czechs have done is tantamount to supporting terrorism.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's an outrageous comment.
Okay, so Nick Vamos thinks it's outrageous and it's proving the point to the Czechs that, listen, you can't trust
Two
Turkey.
US presidents said the very same thing about Osama bin Laden. Was it political statement or was it a sentimental national statement? What document justifies the attack on Osama bin Laden's compound in Afghanistan, in the mountains?
There's a court process underway in the Czech Republic. You should respect that court process.
Everybody does respect that process.
No.
Who said something against it? I mean, they are talking about nations' sentiments about this terrorist did. Did you see the carnage in Ankara when this bomb exploded?
Okay.
Hundreds of people died.
So, Onur, should these comments by senior Turkish government officials be dialed back a little bit, given that the process is going on in the Czech Republic?
Maybe, but if even they're dialed up, I can't blame them. Turkish government, the Turkish people are frustrated. There has been 252 civilians killed in the July 15 coup attempt. There has been, I don't know, I guess close to 1,000 people, soldiers or former soldiers or police officers that fled the country that are responsible of this. Some in Greece, some in Germany, some in England, some in other parts of Europe. Not one has, forget about being extradited, not one has been questioned. The ones that were captured in Greece were bailed out or released on a close watch, but none of them have been questioned, none of them have been extradited. So do understand the Turkish politicians' frustration when it comes to this, because the Turkey, by all means, with every right, does not trust the unjust system of European courts, because they are one-sided when it comes to issues like these. They are blind over every value that Turkey has, for the region has. If it's good to them, it's justice. If it's not, it's not. It doesn't work that way.
Major debates about justice and what it means. Not a lot of trust going around, back and forth between the Turkey, the EU, and across the Atlantic. For the moment, I've got to move on. And I apologize, gentlemen, if not everybody had as much of an opportunity as they wanted. The fault is all my own. Peter Galbraith, Nick Vamos, Hakkı Öcal, and Onur Erim, I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Still ahead on The Newsmakers, Christianity's holiest site reopens after the Israeli government backs down, but their dispute over land and taxes is far from over. And Parkland survivors go back to school as gun advocates say the Florida shooting should be blamed on bad policing and not weapons. The Holy Sepulchre is a church divided. The site in Jerusalem is where Christians believe Jesus was buried and resurrected, and various parts of it are claimed by several different denominations. But one issue has united them, and that's anger over taxes. The Israeli government had proposed a series of tax restrictions against the church after officials said it owed $180 million. Instead of just paying up, the Catholics, Orthodox, and Armenians shut the church down for 3 days, calling the government's move an attack on the Christian presence in the city. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has since backed off. But for how long? With more, here's Vanessa Keneally.
Tourists taking in every inch of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem before its doors were shut to the public. The site, one of the most important to Christians, is built where Jesus is said to have been buried and then rose from the dead. It's visited by hundreds of thousands of pilgrims every year and has survived fires, earthquakes, looting and vandalism. Now it's at the centre of a battle between church leaders and the Israeli government.
Today I get an order from the Greek and the Armenian and the Catholic to closing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because of the problem that our municipality, Jerusalem municipality, asking for high taxes to pay for the churches.
For 3 days the church was closed.
It was like a surprise for me. I didn't know this, but of course it's a shame.
Some people have worked very, very hard to come here and saved. We have one woman who went back to work at 74 in a factory to come on the pilgrimage, and if you can't see some of the churches.
The church doors reopened on Wednesday, but the dispute remains. It began when Jerusalem's mayor said churches owed more than $185 million in property taxes and froze accounts. Christian leaders described the legislation as an attack and a breach of international law, something that didn't go unnoticed abroad.
Jerusalem is a holy city to the three monotheistic religions. This special status and character of the city must be preserved and respected by all.
Tension has been building in the city since December, when US President Donald Trump decided to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and student protests over the withdrawal of subsidies from Christian schools. But those who support the tax bill say it's just about generating revenue that will benefit everyone in the city. For now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed to negotiate to find a solution that will hopefully keep peaceful dialogue as well as the church doors wide open. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Jerusalem is the Israeli parliamentarian who proposed the tax and land policy against the church, Knesset member Rachel Azaria from the centrist Kulanu party. Thank you very much for joining us. Ma'am, given the backlash from the church and now the suspension of the plan, do you regret proposing it?
We have a special humanitarian situation in Jerusalem when thousands of people that lived in their apartments suddenly discovered their apartments don't belong to them, because the apartments were leased by the churches in the early 50s, right after the State of Israel was born. They were leased for 100 years and then another 100 years to an Israeli land company, which is a national company. Unfortunately, the churches sold for a very low price the land to private entrepreneurs, and these private entrepreneurs started going from home to home and demanding that people pay between 200 to 500,000 shekels, which is basically a quarter of the price of the apartment, just for the right to continue living in their apartments. We're usually talking about elderly people that can't move to old age homes because they can't sell their apartments, and they can't even have a lift in their building because they have no way to work with the banks on these issues. So this is an issue that we'll have to deal with. And since it has nothing to do with the churches whatsoever, it's only about land that was sold by the church, I am very, very sorry that this is what was been discussed. I know that there are people that have their own interest to create this international scandal. But at the end of the day, this is an issue that we will have to take care of.
Okay, but hold on. It has been suspended, and the Mayor, Nir Barakat, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will form a government committee to formulate a solution. So again, I don't understand where I've gone wrong here. You proposed a plan. You think it's for one thing. You say there's a backlash for other reasons. There is a backlash. It's suspended, and there'll be a committee. So again, I ask you, given the backlash, and given that the church has been so upset, and when we look at statements from the patriarchs of all the churches, Orthodox, Catholic, Coptic, Anglican, Armenian, Ethiopian, you name it, given all of that and the fact that it was suspended, I ask you again, do you regret tabling it?
No, I think that the major backlash has to do with the fact that the mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barakat, decided to freeze bank accounts that belong to the churches. I think that's a huge mistake. I think that is the reason that the churches started feeling uncomfortable. And then they wondered what's behind this legislation, this bill. But no, this bill has nothing to do with any land that belongs to the churches. nothing to do with it. And I will repeat this again and again. I would be very happy that the land will continue belonging to the churches, because when that was the deal, people could safely live in their apartments. Unfortunately, the entrepreneurs that bought the land for very, very small sum are trying to earn a lot of money on the expense of these elderly people that live in the apartments. That is something that we can't allow that will happen. Now, we're working within the Israeli government on different solutions to this situation that has that has risen. And the Prime Minister, we're waiting with the legislation, but this legislation we will have to deal with. This is a humanitarian situation that we will have to deal with. On the other hand, the decision of Mayor Nir Barkat to freeze the bank accounts of the churches, that was a huge mistake, and I think you can ask him if he's upset about what he did. I can tell you that I met with ambassadors from many countries, and once I discussed with them the bill, everyone understands exactly what the situation is. Also amongst the churches, once we open the dialogue and start the dialogue, they realize it has nothing to do with the land that is owned by the churches. The state of Israel has no intention to change in any way any of the rights of the churches for land in Israel.
Rachel, when the church came out in a statement and they said that this was a systematic campaign against the churches and the Christian community in the Holy Land, they added that. They also said this breaches existing agreements regarding the status quo of the holy sites. And the church leaders had also told Haaretz that this would mortally harm the status of Christians in Israel. Do you believe that they are fundamentally wrong in interpreting it in this way?
I think that it's more complicated than the way it's being presented. I do think that that the churches in Jerusalem, there are several reasons that for the past few years they're feeling less and less. Even though I don't agree with it, I don't think it should happen, but I know that there are groups that are trying to make them feel less and less comfortable. So that's one issue. I also know that there was some land that was sold for very low price, a hotel that there's a very radical group that is trying to make some changes there, and I'm also working to make sure that won't happen. I think that the fact that these two events happened and then the freezing of the bank account, I think it got the churches very nervous. I truly believe, and I also know from working closely with different groups, once we start a dialogue, that they realize that this is an issue that has to be dealt with. Maybe the measures that this issue, the humanitarian issue, will be dealt with, maybe they will be slightly different, but we do need to deal with it. There's not, we can have this discussion and you can say the churches are very upset and, maybe we shouldn't have this bill, but as we're talking, we still have these thousands of families that might lose their homes. And this is something that we have to deal with. I mean, we can't just leave the situation and say, okay, we have this misunderstanding and therefore there's nothing we can do about it. This is something that has to be dealt with.
Okay.
There's no other choice.
And this is why we're having this conversation, to get to the bottom of it. Rachel Azaria, I thank you very much for joining us.
I do want to say that I think that once we get to the bottom of it, it is clear that these are a few issues that were put together, and I'm sure there are solutions for this humanitarian situation.
Understood. Thank you very much. Rachel Azaria joining us there from Jerusalem. Let's broaden this debate out now with our panel. I'm joined from Tel Aviv by Ran Bar Yoshafat. He's the Deputy Director of the Israeli think tank, the Holiest Policy Forum. And in Amman, Jordan, Palestinian Christian Dawood Kutab. He's a journalist and columnist for Al Monitor. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Dawood, let me begin with you. Rachel Azaria, the member of the Knesset who tabled this legislation, told us very clearly this is not against Christians, this is not against the church. It's merely about thousands of people who will lose their homes, and the government, the authorities are trying to make sure that the church doesn't just sell its land to third parties that the government has no idea about. Isn't that accurate?
Well, there are two issues here. There are two issues that happen at the same time. There is the issue of the municipal taxation and there is the issue of the law. They all happen in the same time, and so the protest was on both issues. The land issue is a very controversial issue on different levels. On the level of the church selling what was leased land to business people, that has caused different kind of reactions from the Palestinian community, who felt that this was an unauthorized sale of land. And there is, as you said, there is the situation of Israelis who were living in some of these apartments, who felt that this might be used to create new housing complexes that will be sold for high amounts of money. The whole issue is very complicated, but the clear issue is that we have a government in Israel which likes to take decisions on its own. It doesn't like to share with people. It doesn't like to cooperate with people. It decides things. And they felt that the decision by Trump to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem has created the atmosphere that allows it to take on a small minority of Christian Palestinians and churches. And I think it has been a badly planned mistake that has boomeranged in their face.
Okay, so Ran Bar Yoshafat, would you agree that it has boomeranged because there has been the climb down in recent days?
So I oppose the bail proposition. I think it's a bad one because I don't think the government needs to interfere in people's businesses. Saying that, I think it's a joke that Palestinians are talking about Christians' right. In Israel, the Christian community has grown tremendously, while in Bethlehem it's almost disappeared. So I'm not sure it will boomerang, but I do hope that Israel will do better steps in reaching out for peace with our Christian friends all over the world. And again, as I said, I'm against the bill. I think it's not a good bill. I'm not against confiscating land if it's for a very important purpose, but not for giving it to individuals. Saying that, that's one topic. The other topic is taxation. For taxation, if someone needs to pay their taxes, then they need to pay their taxes. The permits that we're giving for different buildings not to pay taxes are if they're buildings for houses of prayer. And if it's not houses of prayer, then they should pay their taxes. Saying that, still, I think Israel should take diplomatic measures in trying to see how it can solve these diplomatic difficulties.
Ranbar, why'd you give the example of Bethlehem when Israel's in charge of it? You're the military occupier. So isn't any harm to the Christians there a reflection on whoever's running the place, which is Israel?
Strongly disagree. I, as an Israeli Jew, am not allowed to go to Bethlehem because I would be lynched. Right now, Bethlehem is under the Palestinian Authority. If you propose that Israel will annex and implement the Israeli law over Bethlehem, I think it'll be a great solution. I think the Christian community will grow there, and I think Jews will be able to visit a city that is also holy for us. But right now, all of territory A and B is under the Palestinian Authority. Same for Gaza. The Christian community in Gaza has almost disappeared, whereas the Christian community within Israel proper is growing. I don't really think anyone can argue that the minorities within Israel proper have any difficulties with rights. Members of the parliament, ministers, Supreme Court judge that sent our Jewish president to jail, they have full equal rights.
Okay, there was a creative, there was an interesting and creative sort of deflection from the fact of occupation. Nevertheless, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Dawood Kutab, let us talk about this. Let me ask you if you believe that the churches overreacted a little bit here. Because in their statements, when they said this is a systematic campaign, it's an attempt to weaken the Christian presence in Jerusalem, and so forth, did they overreact to an issue about paying taxes?
Yeah, I think three things that happened at the same time that made what happened. The Orthodox bishop is accused of selling land to Israelis, and he needed to clean his name in front of the members of his own church. So I think that played into it. I think also the fact that the population in Jerusalem, whether Christians or Palestinians, are very upset with Donald Trump, and the anger is growing, and the Israelis are putting their hands and they are freezing the bank accounts of the churches. They had no choice but to take this drastic step. You are right, it was a big risk. They took a big risk, and they seem to have partially succeeded in lifting the suspension on their bank accounts.
Ran Bar Yoshafat, do you agree that that was a mistake? Because even MK Rachel Azaria said that the mayor of Jerusalem messed up by freezing the bank accounts of the church.
Again, I say that even with taxation, even if someone needs to pay, I think just because we want to have good relations with the Christian world in general, and yes, I think Israel should, and that's what Israel is doing right now. It's creating a committee to see how they can solve this, this issue of taxation. If property is not being used for a house of prayer, but it's just owned by a Christian person, I don't think it needs to be any different if it's owned by a Jew or an atheist. It doesn't matter at all. The question is a very simple legal question. What was this structure used for?
Dawood Kuttab, very finally, is Israel's relationship with Christians in Jerusalem damaged?
I think it has been damaged for many years. I think we have had lots of problems because the Palestinian Christians are not they're first Palestinians. They are part of the Palestinian community, which is, by the way, under occupation, which is still considered the Geneva Conventions apply to it. So it's not a simple legal issue. It is an area under occupation. And their position, like the Muslims last summer, their position has to be taken care of. And you can't just make unilateral moves against people under occupation and expect them to accept your decisions.
Okay, let's see what happens with the committee that Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barkat and Prime Minister Netanyahu will form. Let's follow this closely. Gentlemen, it's been good to talk to you. I've got to move on. Ran Bar Yoshafat and Dawood Kuttab, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
We shouldn't be banning guns for law-abiding citizens. We should be focusing on making sure that citizens who should not get guns in the first place don't get those guns. And that is why we see a big breakdown in the system here.
It's been 2 weeks since 17 people were killed in a mass shooting at a school in Parkland, Florida. Now students and teachers are going back to class, but are they any safer? The attack has galvanized the campaign for gun reform in the United States, but President Donald Trump has refused to confront the country's gun lobby. Congress won't issue any bans on the weapons and said it won't take up Trump's proposal to arm teachers. So what's stopping another mass shooting from happening again? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined from New York by Paul Michael Violas, a terrorism analyst who worked as a security specialist in the New York District Attorney's Office, and in Washington by Michael Beer. He's the executive director of Nonviolence International. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Paul Violas, let me begin with you. 2 weeks on, let's kind of look at the big picture now with regards to Parkland. Was it a misapplication of the current gun laws and just human error, whether it's by local police, the FBI, and so forth? Or is it becoming clearer and clearer that something fundamentally needs to change in terms of gun control?
I think all of the above. I mean, that's how I would describe that, but I'll break that down as follows. What we saw was a perfect storm with respect to law enforcement, the warning signs that were given off, the amount of time that the shooter spent for over a year saying what he was going to do, a breakdown in school security, and gun laws that completely have gone awry.
Okay, so perfect storm of all of the above. Michael Beer, so I know you're all for non-violence, and I'm assuming you're not a fan of guns, but would you agree that had authorities done their job properly, those kids would not have been butchered, no matter what the laws are?
I'm sure the authorities can always improve and do better, but frankly, the authorities have their hands tied here currently in the United States because we're awash in guns with 3 million guns and millions of semi-automatic weapons. And so there's very little the authorities can do because there's massacres that are going on almost every day in this country.
Paul Violas, is that fair?
Yeah, it's more than fair, but we still have to remember this, and this is the bottom line when it comes to incidences like this, and I agree. But the totality of this incident here was entirely avoidable. We cannot escape that fact. We cannot divert this to a gun issue or any other issue. This kid said what he was going to do. He said it multiple times. And unfortunately, after 38 years in law enforcement, I'm going to say law enforcement failed here. They were told what was going to happen. They didn't do what they needed to do to prevent this. That is the ultimate reason for what happened here. Clearly, we have a gun issue in the United States. There are far too many people that have guns in the United States that should not. And in this case, clearly that was one of them. But that was not the impetus behind what we saw in Parkland.
And Paul, for those who are focusing on the NRA now and directing their anger towards them, is that the right thing to do, or are they going down the wrong path?
It's the wrong path, but I'll tell you, I am not an NRA member. So this is not wave the flag for the NRA. I am not an NRA member. But it's not an NRA issue at this point. Empirical data is empirical data. Shooters, active shooters, school violence shooters, workplace violence shooters are not NRA members. And that's a fact. We know that to be true. So yes, do you want to focus on NRA because the NRA is such a powerful lobby, because they control so much influence in various state legislatures as well as the federal government? Yes, I get that point. But going down the road to pound the hammer on the NRA is not going to solve this particular problem.
Right, Paul, but following the logic, right, if the NRA is that powerful and they're pumping tens of millions of dollars into the pockets of politicians who are supporting legislation or quashing legislation that doesn't address gun control, that you say needs to be addressed, surely they're a prime target here. They're the ones you want to go after because they're skewing the political narrative and, I guess, paralyzing the system, right?
They are paralyzing the system, and that's the best word to actually use at this point. But we're still looking at a problem that's generated by the legislators. Legislators are taking funds during the campaign from the NRA. We know this to be true. It's public information. That buys influence. We know that to be true. We've known this in the United States for a long time. What we're seeing now is this really coming to life before the general public's eyes as to how difficult it's going to be to effect positive change with respect to gun control and evaluating people with mental health issues before they're allowed to carry a gun, constitutional right issues, and the ultimate decision, how much are we in the United States willing to invest in the safety of our children and protecting schools realistically? How much are we willing to embrace our need and responsibility for the reality of security, not the illusion of security?
Okay, and does that mean arming teachers?
No, absolutely no.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Michael Beer, let's talk about the NRA for a moment, because what Paul's saying is, okay, it's all well and good that Delta and United cut ties with the NRA and Dick's Sporting Goods. And I guess what he's saying is it's a bit of virtue signaling. We're seeing a lot of passion, a lot of people going out and being outspoken with regards to the NRA, but it's not going to make a difference because empirically they're not at the root of the problem. Michael, address that.
I agree with my colleague here that the NRA is part of the problem, but is definitely not the totality of the problem. Obviously, the gun industry loves massacres because it makes the society more afraid, so they'll buy more guns. So, in fact, the gun industry loves this kind of thing. And the NRA is sometimes a shill for the gun industry. But as he indicated, many of these killers are not members of the NRA. I think our colleague also makes other great points in the fact that we have many guns in the hands of people who are domestic abusers and who send many signals that they are and have a history of being violent. And we have virtually no way of getting guns out of these folks' hands. So we have a problem really cuts across many areas. But I want to specifically say we should not be scapegoating the mentally ill. We know that scapegoating the mentally ill or a minority group for our society's problem is something that's done a lot in many countries. And the mentally ill are more often the victim of gun violence than they are perpetrators, and they're a minority of the people carrying out massacres.
Okay, good point. Paul, let me ask you about the kids, tremendously articulate and passionate kids, David Hogg, Emma Gonzalez, and so forth, these kids who saw their friends massacred in front of them, not on a battlefield, but when they were at school. They've come out, they've been vocal. A lot of them have been punching up in the biggest way possible against the president, against their politicians, and so forth. People seem to believe that these young people have turned the dial a little bit, and they've opened up the conversation a bit, and they're making real impact. Would you agree with that?
I would, and quite frankly, it's evidenced by the mere fact that globally respected television programs such as the one we are on right now with you have recognized that this is an issue that needs to be spoken about at greater length. We know, being in the media, that incidences like this in the United States oftentimes fall by the wayside after 2 or 3 days after the incident, but it's not now. And I credit these young adults for using their constitutional right in a productive way. In a productive way. They're not burning cars and creating havoc. They're using their constitutional rights, and they're speaking up, and they're projecting what change needs to be implemented in the United States. And I applaud them for that. I believe we should all applaud them for that.
Michael Beer, when they say we are going to be the last school shooting, is that a slogan or is it possible?
It's a slogan, but there's no doubt that the young people can make a difference here. This is going to take generations to get control of 300 million guns and to make better regulations so that people who shouldn't have guns can't get them. So there are 50 states in the United States, each one's with different gun laws, and it's going to take a long, long road in order to get to where we want to go. We have massacres almost every day in this country, and we have school shootings, certainly a few every week in this country.
Paul Violas, looking at what some of the politicians have been doing, especially, predominantly on the Republican side, Governor Rick Scott, we look at Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, Brian Mast, and so forth, seeming to want to listen, whether it's with regards universal background checks and so forth. They're seemingly bending more than they used to in the past. Does that encourage you?
No, it really doesn't, but I'll tell you why it doesn't encourage me. Because what I'm seeing right now is grandstanding. I'm not seeing anybody that's really willing to sit down, roll their sleeves up, and get the job done, and to address the difficult issues. And what I mean by that is to address issues such as gun control that we've talked about, but it's one of these cycling, revolving door issues that we really never address. What I hear right now that's not encouraging are people that are taking advantage of a horrible situation to put out situations and to project solutions that they know are clearly not feasible in the short term. They know that, but they're going to say that anyway. And they can always come back later on and then say, well, you know what, I said it. I stood for it. It can throw my hands up in defeat to saying it's not my fault it didn't happen. So I don't see that. Well, the only thing that's going to really encourage me is when I see legitimate efforts from politicians that are more concerned with doing their job than keeping their job and making the tough decisions, not concerned with what side of the aisle they're on, but making sure we're not stuffing more body bags at schools every other week.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word. Passionately put. Paul Michael Violas and Michael Beer, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers. It was a pleasure. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Islamic academic Tariq Ramadan remains detained after being charged with rape, but his supporters argue the French justice system is treating him unfairly. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.